Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another one of our LFS Online sessions. Tonight will be a very worthwhile session on flying through controlled traffic area as VFR pilots. If you're IFR, it may have some value as well, but predominantly aimed at visual pilots who are probably a little bit rusty or a little bit concerned about flying through CTA, which is understandable. We all get a bit anxious about it. Being LFS pilots, we fly in and out of a CTAF, and so we quite often don't have to interact with ATC at all. So tonight's session is all about dealing with CTA. If you're interested in all in the trace of that map that you can see on the share at the moment, that's one of my navs which went horribly wrong. So we all get a bit confused sometimes, and you can see that it's perfectly okay, or at least I was forgiven for my evils on that particular flight. Sometimes things do go a bit pear-shaped, but it's always okay to ask for help. Gary will be running the session. I'll introduce him in a minute. Just a bit of housekeeping. I know I've popped that up on the chat. We will get you guys to please ask as many questions as you can, but please do ask them through the chat rather than using your microphones. We've got quite a large number of people participating so far, 35 of you, which is fantastic. We're really happy to have that many. The problem is if you all start talking at once, it makes a horrible mess and we can't keep track of it. So if you could please use the chat feature of Zoom to ask questions, unless there's an obvious gap, in which case we certainly can unmute your microphone, but we're muting you by default so that we don't get a whole lot of background noise to confuse things. The session is being recorded, so we will make that available later this evening. It'll be on our YouTube channel and also shared through our Facebook page, so you'll be able to get at that session and use it as a reference later on to go back over stuff. So if we do go things and you miss some of it, that's okay. You'll get a chance to re-watch it and pick up the stuff that Gary's going to go through. So CTA can be quite confronting, especially when you look at a fairly intimidating piece of airspace like south of Melbourne, where there's a lot of stuff going on. And these are some of the things that we're going to demystify as much as we can and provide you with some scenarios to deal with going in and out of various different aerodromes that are common ones for us flying around Victoria, and some which we don't fly around very often, so it's particularly useful to have a look at. We will be looking at requirements to travel through controlled airspace and general procedures to use when you're flying through controlled airspace. And we're doing a quick guide to flying in, out and over each one of these airports: Moorabbin, Avalon, Albury, Essendon and West Sale. So they're the ones we're concentrating on. If you do have any other aerodromes that you're interested in, you can ask us at the end of the session and we may be able to find some of the resources for you fairly quickly. I'm not bad at pulling up VTCs fairly fast, so we can do that at some point. But these are the ones we're going to be concentrating on tonight: Moorabbin, Avalon, Albury, Essendon and West Sale. West Sale's in particular a very interesting one, and so too is Albury, because we do occasionally have to deal with them. So the person who's actually going to be dealing with all of the sessions is Gary McGhee. Gary is the LFS Flying School's chief pilot and also our chief flying instructor. So he looks after all of us rabble flying instructors and tries to keep us all in line. He's also been the RA CFI, and so he understands a lot about flying recreational aircraft as well as general aviation aircraft and the way that they're differently equipped and some of the different requirements. And additionally, he's instructed in Norway, which I'm sure you can imagine would have some interesting challenges. He's got a wealth of experience flying charters in all of Australian airspace. He's our main charter pilot for the flying school. So with that underway, I'm going to hand over now to Gary and we'll get the session underway with him.
G'day everyone. Many thanks for the introduction, Carl, and putting these slides together at quite short notice. Much appreciated. Okay, so why maybe want to fly through controlled airspace? Well, it's a very valid question. Many reasons, and I realise the audience here, broad audience of RPLs, RPCs, possibly PPLs, maybe current, maybe not so current in the current situation with respect to restrictions and flying not being that easy at the moment. So we'll try and focus this being appropriate to all members of the audience. So certainly one of the main reasons for flying controlled airspace would be for efficiency. For example, if you want to fly from Lilydale to Ballarat or the west of Melbourne, rather than trek many extra track miles over Kilmore and such like to the north or south of the city, why not fly directly in controlled airspace, a much directer tracking, much quicker, in many cases, much smoother air if you're flying at higher altitudes, particularly in the summer, if it's quite turbulent, strong northerly winds at low level, strong thermals, much better, much more comfortable for your passengers, much more efficient to be at higher altitude in controlled airspace. Also quite a lot safer, being on an airways clearance, talking to an air traffic controller, well away from the ground, away from obstacles, much safer than bumping around close to terrain in potentially quite heavy turbulence, possibly over relatively higher terrain in terms of to the north of Melbourne, for example. So we'll aim to make the session quite generic in terms of you may want to fly purely just in controlled airspace. You may want to specifically land at a controlled aerodrome or operate at a controlled aerodrome to pick up your passengers, or if you're going to fly to Bankstown, for example, or any other controlled aerodrome, specifically as a destination. There are many different types of controlled airspace, but some generic principles which will apply to each classification of airspace. So once you get used to a certain type of controlled airspace, then you can just follow the generic principles, following the procedures from the URSA primarily. And when you gain a bit more confidence, it's really not that difficult at all, and certainly not something to be afraid of. So we run through CTA operation towards the PPL, part of the syllabus. Also those pilots that have an RPL, for example, you may be aware there's certain endorsements that you can get on your RPL, which will allow you to fly either in controlled airspace, so the CTA endorsements, or the CTR endorsement that will allow you to operate at a controlled aerodrome. So we do training for all of those types of endorsements. It's so once you're used to it, it's definitely a preferred option. If there is CTA along the route, why not plan through it and get an airways clearance rather than try to avoid doing so, which in most cases will make things more difficult, a longer flight and less efficient flight. Okay, next slide, please, Carl. Okay, so what kind of equipment do we need in our aircraft to be able to conduct flight in controlled airspace? Well, clearly we need a means of communicating with air traffic control. So absolutely we need at least one radio, preferably 2 radios is quite useful, in which case you can use one radio for talking to ATC and have a standby frequency ready to go for the next frequency you might talk to. And you can use the second radio, for example, for information type frequencies like an ATIS, an automated terminal information service, which commonly controlled aerodromes will have an ATIS, at least during tower operational hours. So requirement for a transponder, clearly then air traffic control can see you on the radar screen They can see exactly where you are, what your altitude is, etc. And if you've been given a discrete squawk code, so an individual 4-digit code, they'll know exactly which point on the radar screen corresponds with your aircraft. So clearly, legally, we need a number of charts to fly and a paper copy URSA, or we're also legally allowed to have electronic flight bag, such as Avplan being the Lauderdale preferred option. In that case, you need two devices of at least iPad mini size, which will cover the requirement without needing any paper-based charts. Or alternatively, you could just have a paper-based chart as a backup and one iPad, for example, running Avplan. So recommended to have a GPS as well in the aircraft. Certainly makes tracking easier. So for example, a Garmin 430 with an up-to-date database, very useful, will make the flight more efficient, will allow you to be able to track more accurately within the required tolerances within controlled airspace. So we need to be within a mile of track, and if we go beyond that, then we need to advise ATC. So that's certainly going to be a lot easier if we've got a GPS and in addition to an EFB. All right, next slide, please, Scott. Okay, so in the example that we had briefly mentioned there, Lauderdale to Ballarat. So ordinarily that would be a relatively longer flight if we had to track and try to remain outside controlled airspace. We'd have to track all the way up towards Kilmore if we were going around to the north, and then virtually direct tracking at relatively low altitude to remain below the steps over to Ballarat or to the south of the city. In either case, we're going to be relatively close to the terrain. So cloud permitting, clearly as VFR pilot, the preferable option, if we were able to, would be to track in controlled airspace. And we could literally track from Lilydale via the Melbourne VOR directly then to Ballarat. So the preference overflying Melbourne is above 6,000 feet is the requirements as per the URSA procedures page for Melbourne Tullamarine. So we're well away from any of the jets arriving or departing into Tullamarine then. So as a VFR hemispherical level, 6,500 feet tracking to the west, or on return from Ballarat to Lilydale, 7,500 would be the appropriate altitude. So clearly this whole procedure is much more slick and happens a lot easier if we've already filed a flight plan. It is possible to do it without a flight plan, but then you're basically asking the controller to do something on the fly. You're trying to organize something that's not being necessarily pre-planned in advance. So much easier by filing a flight plan, the requirement for which is at least 30 minutes or before your estimated off blocks time. So it doesn't have to be too long before, just say 15 minutes or so before you start taxiing is ample time. So if we use the example of departing Lilydale for Ballarat, all we would need to do once we're airborne above the line of the Christmas Hills, so we've got line of sight reception to Tullamarine, would be to request that clearance. So fairly straightforward. So if we just use an example that we're in Archer Romeo Charlie Romeo, so the call will be Melbourne Centre, the the frequency we're addressing, which would be 135.7. The Melbourne Centre, VFR Archer Romeo Charlie Romeo is airborne Lilydale for Ballarat. 2 POB, request clearance. So they'll come back to you. Normally they'll ask you to stand by whilst they're coordinating that clearance. Normally fairly soon they'll come back with a discrete 4-digit squawk. So they may come back and say Romeo Charlie Romeo squawk 4357, for example. So you'd read that back to them, and whilst you're doing this, you can continue tracking towards Melbourne, the Melbourne VOR itself. So if you put it into your Garmin 430, ML is the waypoint. So you can continue tracking towards the west, you can continue climbing towards 2,500 feet, at least initially. And ordinarily they'll come back with a clearance fairly soon, within 30 seconds to a minute or so, in which case you probably haven't even reached 2,500 feet anyway, so you can just continue climbing towards Melbourne VOR. And the clearance will be something like Romeo Charlie Romeo, you're clear to Ballarat via Melbourne, climb 6,500. And you just simply read that back. They may give you the QNH and ask you to verify altitude, in which case you just repeat the QNH that you've been given and say that you're passing 2,100 feet or whatever altitude you may be at. And that allows the controller to verify that the squawk that they see on the radar screen of you at 2,100 feet is actually you actually at 2,100 feet. So it's a cross-reference. So then ordinarily you just continue climbing towards 6,500 feet. Melbourne Centre 1357 may transfer you over to Melbourne approach frequency 132.0, and there may be some vectoring or slight heading changes according to traffic as you go. There may be another change of frequency as well as you overfly Melbourne. And then as you're tracking out from Melbourne to Ballarat, at some point you're going to go outside controlled airspace. So around about 30 miles to the west or so of Melbourne. And at that point, the controller will just say, control services terminated, own navigation, Ballarat. And, effectively, then you're outside controlled airspace and you're following CTAF procedures in towards Ballarat on the local CTAF. So in all of that, if you're unable to accept any of the clearances, like if it turns out that 6,500 feet is actually going to put you too close to cloud, just tell them as you're approaching that altitude before you go into the cloud clearly, that you need to level off at, let's say, 5,500 to cloud, and they will be able to coordinate that for you. Yeah, so tolerances, ideally, we're not going beyond 2 miles either side of tracking effect tolerance. We're in Class C airspace at that point, and basically just following advice from the controller on what to do in terms of tracking and any other frequencies to change to. So always important as well, if you're planning a flight like this, the clearance may not be given at the moment. Clearly, the radar screens are fairly quiet. There's not much traffic around, so most clearances are given quite easily, and that should be the case as well when we open up in a few weeks' time. However, best to have a plan B in case that clearance is not available for whatever reason.
So Gary, just a quick question for you.
Yep.
When you do fly through controlled airspace, at some point they're going to stop giving you routing instructions. So, for example, you're flying towards Ballarat, you're overhead Melbourne. They might tell you to resume on navigation. How does that work?
So that basically means wherever you are, you just track direct to Ballarat. And there would be nothing wrong with asking for a vector for that as well. No problem. They'll just say fly heading 260 or whatever it may be. But provided you've got a GPS in the aircraft, you can just reset your GPS. Let's say you're approaching the Melbourne VOR, but you're not there yet. You can just then select in the flight plan Ballarat and press direct to enter, and then track directly from that point straight to Ballarat.
So I guess, Gary, one of the key parts of that is when you are flying around through controlled airspace, it's important to keep track of where you are if you're being vectored around, so that when they do hand you over, you know where you are for your next leg.
Absolutely. Yep, situational awareness is very important, particularly if there have been multiple vectors. Yeah, might be slightly disorientated if you're not keeping the track of where you're going. Okay, on to the next slide then. Okay, so Moorabbin, probably a lot of you are quite familiar with Moorabbin, maybe been there relatively recently, probably not in the last 3 to 6 months though. Certainly as part of our PPL syllabus, we'll generally train pilots Class D procedures for Moorabbin and Essendon Class C procedures as part of the PPL syllabus. So really how to get into Moorabbin from Lilydale is a valid question. Quite straightforward once you're used to it. Doesn't necessarily need a flight plan, but a flight plan will help. So the obvious tracking point from Lilydale to Moorabbin is the visual reporting point, the VRP, which is Academy. So the requirement is, if you read the URSA planning pages, facility planning pages, that you report at Academy at 1,500 feet, having already listened to the ATIS, so you know which runway is in use and you know the weather conditions, etc. on the day. And you basically just report at Academy, and it's literally like telling the tower you're coming in. It's an implied clearance, and they basically just tell you which runway to use and ordinarily which leg of the circuit to join. So let's say you're coming in, you've planned at 1,500 feet from Lilydale. As you're approaching, or between Lilydale and Academy, once you're level at 1,500 feet, you'll listen to the ATIS on the frequency 120.9. And then approaching Academy, you'll transfer over to the tower frequency, so the eastern tower frequency, which is 118.1. And the call would be something along the lines of Moorabbin Tower, Archer Romeo, Charlie Romeo is approaching Academy, 1,500, received ATIS inbound. One important point in Class D procedures as well is that you change your squawk code from the VFR frequency that you're on ordinarily, 1200, you change it to 3000 or 3000 prior to making the call. So then tower know that you're a Moorabbin aircraft. Okay, so once you've made that call, they'll just say, let's say there's a northerly wind on the day. They'll say, Romeo, Charlie Romeo, Moorabbin Tower, join downwind runway 35 right. So you repeat that to them. And the requirement is then that you descend down to 1,000 feet by the time that you reach 3 miles from Moorabbin. So you see the ring around the control zone here at 3 miles. Circuit traffic is at 3 miles, so tower want you to be at 1,000 feet, and therefore circuit height at 3 miles, so that any other aircraft, then you'll see them on the horizon and that stand out most clearly. So you continue in, and then when you are downwind, so when you're abeam the upwind threshold of runway 35, just report to tower that you're downwind for full stop. And they'll come back and they may say that you're number 2 to a Cessna, which is late downwind, or they may give you some further traffic information. Then basically you don't need to do anything further, you just keep flying the circuit around, and at some point, normally somewhere on final, they'll say Romeo, Charlie, Romeo, clear to land. You repeat that to them, and then that's your landing clearance, clear to land. Then there's the ground operation, but that's probably don't really have time to go through ground operation at all of these airfields tonight. So we'll purely talk about how to get into them. Maybe how to get out of Moorabbin. So fairly straightforward. On the ground at Moorabbin, you just talk to ground, tell them which runway that you want to use, the fact that you've received the ATIS, and again, they'll then give you a taxi clearance to, let's say, 35 right, for tracking back towards Lolita. Okay, on to the next slide. Okay, so Avalon, quite an interesting airport to go into, different times of the year. Most people only go there once every 2 years to see the air show, but it is quite well worth doing at other times as well. Whilst the air show is on, really only using Avalon East, which is a grass strip on the east side of Avalon main airport. But any other time, you can certainly go and land or make a touch and go or just overfly Avalon Airport. At the moment, it's quite sad but spectacular to see a lot of parked aircraft there. So how would we go about planning a flight from Lilydale to Avalon? Specifically in controlled airspace. So of course we could try to avoid controlled airspace by flying around the Melbourne coastal route along the north side of Point Cook, and we could report somewhere like Werribee Racecourse, which is just on this chart up here. Is a visual reporting point, or a much more seamless, easy way to do it, more efficient, would be to specifically plan to fly from Lilydale in controlled airspace to Avalon, directly to Avalon, at let's say 4,500 feet, cloud permitting. In which case, similar to the Ballarat example, we would make an airborne call out of Lilydale. So again, we'd do that on Melbourne Centre frequency 135.7. So Melbourne Centre, Archer Romeo, Charlie Romeo, airborne Lilydale for Avalon to POB, request clearance. We filed our flight plan, and they'll go through the same procedure, giving you a squawk code and then giving you airways clearance if clearance is available at 4,500 over towards Avalon. So then at some point as you're approaching Avalon, 135.7 will give you a handover then to Avalon approach, which is 133.55, and then they'll give you further instructions and a descent as you're getting towards Avalon. And then if you're making a landing at Avalon, they'll hand you over to tower, who would most likely, if it was let's say runway 18 in use to Avalon, they'll just ask you to join a left base for runway 18 or possibly a 3-mile final, something like that.
Gary, I've got a couple of questions about procedures at Avalon.
Yep.
In particular, one of them is what you need to do before you go in there. Do you need to bring them up and book a slot or anything like that? And another question Ahmed has asked, what if you're asked to overfly the tower?
Sure. So the first question, definitely file the flight plan. There is only requirements booking slots for instrument training overhead the navigation aids at Avalon. So as a VFR arrival, there is no requirement to book a slot. And you just...
I know when I flew in there on a charter about 1.5 years ago, and the details were a bit sketchy, I was asked on the way in if I'd booked a slot to fly in if they knew I was coming.
Right.
Amanda had already rung that up to organise that for me, but I hadn't read through the URSA particularly thoroughly. Is that a requirement, or was I misunderstanding?
I can't see it in the URSA here. I've been in several times over the last year without booking a slot. I've just filed a flight plan and it's been no issue. So then the other question, recently I went in with Julian Satis in this CT4. There's definitely no requirement for a slot.
It happens.
Yeah, all good. So the other question was to overfly Avalon. Is that right?
That's correct, yes. Ahmed has asked, what if you're asked to overfly the tower?
Overfly the tower? Okay. So if you plan to land at Avalon and they've asked you to overfly the tower?
So what I might do, Gary, is I might actually get Ahmed to ask you the question directly, because I think we might have got our wires crossed a bit. He's referring to Moorabbin, not to...
Okay.
So Ahmed, if you want to open up your microphone and just ask your question to Gary directly.
Yeah, I think I might get one in beans actually. So occasionally, if at Moorabbin, if the eastern circuit is quite busy, let's say you're coming in from Lilydale to Moorabbin, if the eastern tower frequency or the eastern circuit is too busy, like they allow 8 aircraft as a maximum in there at once. If there is that many already, then they may ask you to maintain 1,500 feet, overfly the field and contact the western tower frequency in the overhead, and they'll just simply ask you to clear the visual approach and join downwind for runway 35 left. If that answers the question. Ordinarily though, if you don't want to land at Avalon, but you may want to overfly, as you can see from the diagram here, it's Class D airspace from the surface to 2,500 feet within the Avalon control zone here. And then it's Class C airspace from 4,500 feet and above. So in between the Class D airspace from the surface to 2,500, between that and the Class C airspace starting at 4,500, there's this slice of Class E airspace between 2,500 and 4,500. So there is no requirement for a clearance to fly through Class E airspace, but you must have a transponder selected to altitude mode, and you must be monitoring the local area frequency. So in this case, Avalon approach 133.55. So then you could quite happily fly westbound anywhere between 2,500 and 4,500. So hemispherically, if you are able to, due cloud, traffic, etc., 2,500 feet preferably, or 4,500 feet. or if you're traveling eastbound, the ideal altitude hemispherically would be at 3,500 feet if you wanted to overfly Avalon. No harm in making a call to Avalon approach, always very friendly. You could literally make a call that let's say you're tracking somewhere from the west, let's say you've been down to Apollo Bay or somewhere like that and tracking back towards Lilydale, and you want to overfly specifically Avalon. You could just give a call that you're 10 miles to the southwest at 3,500 feet, tracking via the Avalon VOR to the northeast, request traffic. So that kind of call has a couple of functions. It lets the controller know who you are and what your intentions are. It will also give them the opportunity to give you any traffic information, of which there can sometimes be some instrument trailing traffic overhead at Avalon, overhead the radio navigation aids there. All right.
Just with traversing Avalon,
yep.
On the odd occasion, you may need to change altitude for operational reasons into the Class D airspace. So, for example,
yep.
flying over from the west and you're at 2,500 and there's low cloud and you need to drop
yep.
below that. What will be the procedure there to get permission to do that?
So very, very similar to a Moorabbin type example as Academy, you could use one of the visual reporting points. There's some of them shown on here, for example, Bowen Prison. But essentially anywhere with at least a reasonable margin until you get to the controlled airspace. So you could just call Avalon Tower that you're, let's say 15 miles to the southwest at 2,000, intending to track via the Avalon overhead to the northeast. Received ATIS, so preferably listen to the ATIS before you make the call. That will give you the QNH, so you've got an accurate altitude, and they will give you a clearance then if they're able to, or if they're not, they'll suggest some alternative tracking to help out.
I know I had an experience coming back on a charter where I was at 2,500 and needed to drop down quite low fairly suddenly through some unexpected changes in the weather.
Yep.
And I just basically made a call. Avalon Tower, Romeo Charlie Romeo, no, sorry, it was in Romeo November Mike, request to overfly at 2,100 due weather, and they put that straight away.
Yeah, that'd work. Cool. All right. On to the next slide then. So Albury is slightly different. So it is Class D, like Moorabbin and Avalon. But they have more of a procedural system at Albury. So same kind of idea that you report at one of the visual reporting points after listening to the ATIS. And they'll give you a clearance for then the the runway in use. Slightly different when you exit or when you depart Albury. They will ask you for a departure call or something like a departure call, which IFR pilots are quite familiar with, but so that they can coordinate traffic that may be inbound, for example, whilst you're departing. They will ask what is your outbound radial, your altitude passing, and your estimate for a next waypoint, which most IFR pilots wouldn't be too phased by. As a VFR pilot, having flown into Moorabbin and Avalon, it's slightly different, but something you can definitely plan in your pre-flight planning and be used to and prepared for when you depart. Normally, if you haven't actually given a departure report by a certain point, the tower will ask for it anyway. So they'll prompt you and help you. Better if you follow the full procedures and make that departure report without them having to chase you up for it. Okay, on to the next slide, please, Carl. Okay, so into West Sail now. So there are a number of different types of airspace and whether you can, or a number of different types of restricted airspace, and whether you can plan into them or not. So there's basically three categories of restricted airspace. So there's RA1, RA2, and RA3. So restricted airspace type 1, pilots may flight plan through the restricted airspace and expect a clearance under normal circumstances. Restricted airspace category 2, you must not flight plan through that restricted airspace unless you're on a route specified in the ERSA general flight planning requirements. And then the highest level of restricted airspace, which is RA3, is you must not flight plan through it because there won't be a clearance available. So on that basis, West Sail falls under the category of RA2, so restricted airspace type 2. So you can plan through it, provided that you plan on a specified route, of which there are some routes shown by the purple dotted lines.
Just planning through that and the types of restricted airspace.
Yeah.
For recreational aviation pilots without CTA and CTZ endorsements, is that something that they can do if the restricted area is active?
Good question. It's still a form of controlled airspace. So if you don't have a controlled airspace endorsement, I would say no.
Okay. So RA pilots can't plan to fly through restricted airspace if the restricted airspace is active.
That's my understanding.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So yeah, a PPL or an RPL student or RPL pilot, recreational pilot license holder with a navigation endorsement and a controlled airspace endorsement. They would require that to operate in this form of restricted controlled airspace and to make a landing, for example, at West Sail. So the procedures for landing at West Sail vary, as you'll read in the ERSA pages, according to whether the East Sail military controlled airspace is allowed, is active or not. So if the East Sail airspace is active, then you need clearances from East Sail approach. If the airspace is not active, then this is all completely uncontrolled airspace, and you can operate, for example, into West Sail as a CTAF with normal CTAF procedures applying. So let's say the airspace is active, which it's normally Monday to Friday office type hours, although you'd need to check specifically in the ERSA for the operational hours. If it is active, then you need to contact Sail Approach on frequency 123.3 a way out before you would enter that controlled airspace to allow them time to give you a clearance. And then when you land, after you land at East Sail, there's a requirement to report when you've landed and clear of the runway. Okay. All right, on to the next slide, please, Carl.
Just got one more question about this particular bit of airspace. We obviously, restricted areas can sometimes be activated whilst you're in flight, after you've done your flight plan. Would you recommend, as you get close to the restricted airspace coming into around the sail area, if you're planning on flying outside of the VFR lane, the little lane up there to the north, of calling ATC and confirming the status of that restricted airspace if it was during a time when it was likely that it could become active?
Certainly nothing wrong with doing that. Normally, Melbourne Sensor will make a broadcast on the area frequency in advance of airspace becoming active. So I don't think they do it necessarily routinely, but possibly five or 10 minutes before it becomes active, they'll make a call saying it's becoming active at 8 AM, for example. It may be 10 to 8 when they make that broadcast.
Martin Smith's asked if you've got any pointers for transiting up the coastline along Orbost.
So here along 90 Mile Beach, there is a procedure to follow. I can certainly get details on that, and maybe we can provide it to them after the session. I don't have the details to hand. Certainly, if the airspace is not active, then it's very straightforward. You can just literally follow the coastline. If it is active, you need some form of clearance.
Looks like there's a fair bit of room underneath it. That restricted area is, you probably get underneath it without too much difficulty by the look of that.
Looks like, yeah, some of it between 1,000 and 6,000 within.
Watch out for hang gliders, I guess.
Yeah, need to look carefully on the chart. Yeah, we'll get back to them with the answer on that. Yeah, so the procedures outlined for airspace being active in the facilities section of the URSA. And we've got pages there for West Sail and East Sail. There are some parts of the West Sail URSA entry that say refer to East Sail when the airspace is active. So you need to look at both of them. Okay, on to the next slide, please, Scott.
We've just got a quick question from Tony Collette, who wants to know about when you're approaching East Sail, when would you contact ECD as opposed to approach?
As with any of these calls that you make to ATC requesting the clearance, do that at least 5 minutes before the clearance is required, so that if you don't get the clearance, then you can take up a hold or organise some alternate tracking. Okay, so on to Essendon. A little bit closer to home. So again, this is now a Class C aerodrome. So specifically, an airways clearance is required here to enter the zone. So if we're tracking from Lilydale for a landing at Essendon, commonly we'll track via Doncaster Shopping Town. However, Warrandyte is also an option, which is slightly more commercially efficient from Lilydale, in a few less track miles. But either way, whether either at Warrandyte, which is arguably not necessarily quite so easy to see, or Doncaster, what the procedure that you'd follow would be as you're tracking between Lilydale and either Warrandyte or Doncaster. You listen to the ATIS and then you make a call on the tower frequency. So Essendon tower frequency 125.1. There'll be Essendon tower, Archer Romeo Charlie Romeo, Doncaster Shopping Town 1500, received ATIS, request clearance. So ordinarily, if you've got a flight plan in place, it's easier than without. They'll just come back with Romeo Charlie Romeo, Essendon Tower, you're cleared, Doncaster Shopping Town, Essendon, maintain 1500. So repeat that back to them, and then they give you further instructions as you get closer. So yeah, if it's a reasonable westerly, runway 26 is in use, it's virtually straight in, tracking straight in towards Essendon, landing straight in on runway 26, or if there's a strong northerly, they may say, clear to visual approach, join right base, runway 35, or if it's a southerly, it may ask you to join a left base for runway 17.
So Gary, with regards to Essendon,
Yep.
If you're trying to get into Essendon from, say, you've been off somewhere in the northeast, and you're coming in from perhaps Ballarat or Bendigo or somewhere like that, what would your procedure be there? Where would you make your clearance request, and who would you talk to?
So let's say we're coming from Bendigo, just for variation. So if you submitted a flight plan that you wanted to fly in controlled airspace, specifically in controlled airspace for a landing at Essendon. So let's say you planned it, let's say it's quite a hot, bumpy northerly day. You've planned between Essendon, Bendigo and Essendon at 7,500 feet. You would make a call to Melbourne Centre in advance, let's say at least 5 minutes before the clearance was required, out to the northwest of Melbourne, just as you were departing Bendigo, requesting a clearance in a similar way as we did going out of Lilydale towards Ballarat. They'll then hand you over to possibly approach, who then may give you some vectors and then hand you over towards to tower as you get closer. So it also, specifically planning in controlled airspace, can make the whole process much more straightforward. The alternative being, if you wanted to try and avoid flying in controlled airspace until really the last moment, is that you would then have to report at Calcallo, which is to the north of Essendon, just off this shot, I think. Can't see it on there. I think it's just slightly north of Craigieburn. And then they may not give you a clearance via there. They may ask you to track around towards Doncaster, in which case you even further track miles. So much easier coming from Bendigo to Essendon, planned specifically in controlled airspace. ATC will facilitate the process and make it much more seamless.
Are there any preferred waypoints for coming in from that direction? For example, in a flight plan, would you plan via the Melbourne airport before you came into Essendon, or something else advised to give yourself the best chance of getting that clearance?
Yeah, good question. So there is a section in the URSA, which is the flight planning requirements section of the URSA, the FPR. So then you scroll down to Victoria and Melbourne, Essendon. Just get it on the screen of my iPad here. And it will say exactly which are the preferred tracking waypoints. So from the northwest, it's got a section, there's a section on the IFR arrivals in there, but for a VFR flight plan, so you could track via some IFR waypoints, which might sound a bit scary to the average VFR pilot, but it really is not a big deal. You'll certainly be able to find them in your in the GPS and on an ERC chart or a TAC chart. So via RB, and then the Melbourne VOR direct to Essendon. If anyone has any specific questions about specific flight planning, clearly we can help in the office as well. Or people want to send us an email or give us a call.
Yeah, Gary, we've also got a lot of information from Essendon in particular. The first one of our LFS Online seminars was with Keller Callahan, sorry, who's a senior ATC who works at Essendon, and that's all recorded and available. So if anyone does actually want to get a lot more detail about Essendon, he spent a good hour or so talking about those procedures.
Okay.
We'll have that available on our YouTube channel, which you can have a look at a later stage as well. And he goes into a lot of detail about getting in and out of Essendon.
Well, worth having a listen to that. All right, on to the next slide, please, Carl. So what ideally should you study or take with you when you're flying in controlled airspace, or what are the reference documents? Well, certainly the URSA and specifically the facility details for each of the airports. Having a look at the flight procedures section. It's a very important part of any pre-flight planning in controlled airspace. Visual flight rules guide will give you further information of how to plan such a flight, and an easy to interpret view of the rules and the CASA documents. There used to be a CASA on-track system, which they've now taken off the website. A much more useful guide was the Visual Basin Guide, which unfortunately went out of print about 10 years ago. But we've got PDF copies, and although some of the information is slightly out of date, it's a very good guide in terms of pictures of the Melbourne visual reporting points around the Melbourne Basin, and the radio calls haven't essentially changed at all. So clearly you can use us as instructors as well. Doesn't cost anything for giving us a call and having a chat about procedures, or we can role play or do ground briefings on the instructor pretending to be ATC as you, the pilot, and we can role play certain scenarios, or of course we can go on dual flights as well as refresher flights, and instead of perhaps Moorabbin or Essendon being the only controlled airport you go into every 2 years when you do your flight review, and maybe a little bit apprehensive about doing so. If you get a bit more currency, and we'll join you on dual navs and increase confidence level and currency on operating in controlled airspace. Certainly at the moment as well, with Melbourne airports being very quiet, certainly I've done it myself a few times with PPLs or CPLs as a dual exercise, flying into Tullamarine, either as a landing full stop or just going around, is a well worthwhile experience. The landing fee is quite high, but people I've been in with or on IFR flights doing an instrument approach into Melbourne Tullamarine, they found it very beneficial. So I fully expect when we open up in a few weeks or so, Melbourne Tullamarine to be not particularly busy yet. So that is a very worthwhile experience. Anyone that might want to do that, or even something a bit more straightforward, a city orbit as well. In fact, no extra charges there other than the cost of the aircraft and possibly an instructor if you go with an instructor. But you'll get familiarization then and talking to Essendon Tower and contact with ATC. It's a well worthwhile experience, and certainly then to take your passengers on a guided tour around Melbourne in 40 minutes or so from Lilydale. It's very worthwhile. Okay.
Okay, so thank you very much, Gary. I think that's most of what we were planning on covering tonight. We've gone through about an hour of Gary's stuff and answered a few questions along the way. What I'd really like to do now is, because I'm sure a lot of you have got questions about specific things, if you have any specific procedural questions for Gary, now is the time. We've got probably 15 or 20 minutes or so that we've allocated for questions. So if you have any specific procedural stuff you'd like to know about that we haven't covered or perhaps you're not sure about, now is your chance. So please ask some questions.
You received any on the chat?
Hello.
Hello?
Hi, Gary.
Yeah, is that Tony?
Yes, Tony. Yeah. I was asking a question before, but I wasn't sure. I don't think I made it clear. I was wondering about when you approach, which I never have done, ESAIL BFR, because I've gone in IFR. Do you, when you're talking about contacting approach, do you contact aircraft clearance delivery on a different frequency, or would you contact approach?
I think initially approach control delivery 133.6,
Yeah.
and at some point then they'll transfer you to SAIL approach 123.3.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Certainly, if you planned it as a flight, a new flight plan from Lilydale to, let's say, West SAIL in controlled airspace, Melbourne Centre would tell you which frequency to contact next anyway.
Yeah. If you're IFR, they'll switch you over.
Yeah, or if you're even VFR, but you planned specifically in controlled airspace.
Yeah.
And Gary, Julian's asked if there's anything specific you need to do if you're going to pick someone up from Moorabbin, apart from know their phone number.
No, not really. So that knowing where you can pick them up from logistically is important, of course. The obvious place is the passenger terminal, which is just south of the tower. And you used to be able to park directly outside the passenger terminal. Now Oxford seems to operate most of that. So the short-term parking or itinerant parking is there's a box specifically just within the tower that you can park in just slightly south and southeast of the tower. So once you've parked there, specifically the whole aeroplane needs to be parked within that box, shut down, and then you can go and meet your passengers at the passenger terminal. There is a key code to get through the door. It changes on about a 2-weekly basis or so, but the code is always displayed next to the keypad on the air side. So not a bad idea to take a photo of that. and use that code to get through. It's the same code to get back from the ground side back to airside. Or dates of the Second World War seem to work as well, 1939 or 1945. Right. Anyone else?
It looks like that might be just about it, Gary. So thank you very much for your time this evening, presenting all this information to us. I know I've got a lot from it, and I'm sure everyone else has. We're all pretty rusty with flying through controlled airspace. Just a reminder, as Gary was saying, we are, of course, very happy as soon as we can get flying again, which we're hoping will be mid to late October. Anyone who wants to do a bit of a brush up on their controlled airspace procedures is more than welcome to book a flight with us. City orbits are particularly good ones. It's a nice gentle introduction if you're a bit rusty on it, and they're good fun. It's really nice to go for a bit of a hoon around the city and take some nice photos. And again, there is still that opportunity to get into Melbourne Airport, which is, again, it's one of those kind of once in a lifetime things. And it might be something that you want to consider, and we're certainly quite able to do that as well. But primarily what I want to do is thank you, Gary, for your time this evening. It's we very much appreciate you taking your time out on a Wednesday night when you're sure you'd rather be with your family. But thank you enormously for your time this evening. Just so you all know too as well, we've got those PDFs of the Melbourne Basin and also the Sydney and Adelaide Basin guides. We've got them as PDFs. They're a bit too big to email around, but we can get them to you if you can come out to the flying school when you're able to. And Frank's asked a question about getting in and out of Essendon with an access card. And the answer is you don't need one at Moorabbin, but you do need one at Essendon, I think, Gary?
Yeah, there's a specific like a key fob thing. It's about $25 a year. So if you've got an aircraft that's based at Essendon, definitely worth getting one of those. Or if you don't have one, if you're only going the odd 1 or 2 times, you can call security and they'll let you through. Normally they may want to see your asset card. Otherwise they'll let you through.
So, but with Moorabbin, you don't necessarily need a card. You can get in and out through the doors just by knowing the code too. So you don't actually need a card at Moorabbin. Other things that we can do at Lilydale, obviously we have, if you're not looking at PPL, but you want to do a controlled traffic endorsement, we certainly can do that. I think Gary mentioned that earlier on, and we've got instructors able to do that, and we can carry out an exam and those sorts of things to help you out with that as well, which will get you up to speed on those procedures. But yeah, thank you very much again, everyone, for coming along this evening. We peaked at, I think, about 46 people, which is terrific for a Wednesday night with very short notice. And I hope you all got something out of it. Again, this session has been recorded. We will be putting it online probably in the next hour or so. It takes a little bit of time to transcode and then upload, but that will be done. And that'll be on our YouTube channel. If you just search on YouTube for Lilydale Flying School, you'll be able to find us. And I will also post the link on our Facebook page. Thank you again, everyone, for coming along. Thank you, Gary. And,
thanks, everyone. Thanks, Carl.
Out at the airport very soon. And we'll have another one of these sessions, I hope, next week with something else, hopefully of interest to all of you. If you do have any suggestions for things you'd like us to cover in any of these seminars, please let me know. We do want to provide you guys with as much information as we possibly can. So don't be shy to send me an email. And I certainly do with the inspiration. I'm starting to run out of ideas. So please let us know what you'd like us to cover, and we'll do our best to make it happen for you. And thanks again.
Thanks, Carl.
Good night, everyone. Have a great day.